we are going to now switch to our next plenary. And this plenary this is about privacy and confidentiality. So this has been a hot topic among many census watchers over the past few years. For those of us who follow the ACS closely, this has really been of keen interest. So the next panel will present information about what is proposed for the ACS and ways that data users might engage on this topic. And so we are delighted that Melissa Chu will be moderating this panel. Melissa C. Chu is the director of this Committee on National Statistics, or CenStat, at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Before joining CenStat, she spent 15 years leading data policy governance, analytics, and production in the federal government at the Department of Veteran Affairs and the U.S. Census Bureau, and briefly in the Office of Management and Budget's Statistical and Science Policy Branch. So without further ado, we are going to switch to this plenary, and I will attempt to figure out how to put this on our slideshow. Yeah. Oh, this one. It's blocked. Let's try. Okay. All right. Thank you, Melissa. Oops. Oops.
Do they have my slides? I was going to give the slides on the right. No, okay. No, that's fine. I'm just going to, I'll just like give them my notes. Hello, everybody. I'm Melissa Chu. I'm the director of CNStat. As of about 2 months ago, you may be familiar with my predecessor, Brian Harris-Coteen, who worked in the Office of Statistical and Science Policy at LMB for many years. So today, I would like to introduce to you our esteemed panel. It will be Rolando Rodriguez, is a mathematical statistician in the Center for Enterprise Dissemination at the U.S. Census Bureau. He has implemented methods for protecting respondent privacy in several censuses and surveys, and is currently involved in efforts to modernize privacy practices in the 2020 census and the American Community Survey. Next, we have Leslie Reynolds, who is a research analyst at the Cornell University Program on Applied Demographics, PAD. She has been actively involved in evaluating 2020 census data through research, feedback, and presentations, such as the 2022 CNStat workshop, to evaluate the differential privacy demonstration data. And then as a discussant, we have Dr. Joseph Salvo, who is an Institute Fellow within the Biocomplexity Institute and Initiative Set at the University of Virginia. He is also currently a senior advisor to the National Conference on Citizenship and serves on the CNStat panel to evaluate the quality of the 2020 census. So for more than 25 years, Dr. Salvo was the director of the Population Division at the New York City Department of City Planning. But before we begin, I'd just like to sort of like do a little bit of level setting, since I believe that this users conference is attended by many people of different experience with the American Community Survey. So the question is, what is data? What is disclosure avoidance? So by disclosure avoidance, we mean that it's a process to protect the confidentiality of respondents' personal information and published data, right? And so the Census Bureau is actually mandated to protect the data and the people who've the information to people who have responded to its censuses and surveys. So disclosure avoidance is not new. It was first used in the 1930 census, when some tables for small geographic areas were not published to protect respondents' confidential data. Later on in 1970, we had whole table suppression. In 1990, there was data swapping and other techniques. And in 2020, we now have differential privacy. So the differential privacy framework, which is used on the 2020 census, is new, however. So this means that there have been advances in technology and rapid growth of new databases that have increased concerns about the data privacy and confidentiality. This is a digital world that we live in nowadays. So differential privacy is a new disclosure avoidance framework that adds statistical noise to data. So this means small additions or subtractions to data in tables so that no one can associate the published data with a specific person or household with certainty. So far, differential privacy algorithms have been applied to the 2020 census and a few other select government data. But at present, there are no plans to apply the techniques used in the 2020 census to the ACS data, but the science does not yet exist. But we're here today to talk a little bit about what is being done and what is planned for the ACS and different, and to grapple a little bit with like what some of those options might be, and then we can have a discussion about that afterwards. And with that, would like to invite Rolando Rodriguez to come to the microphone. Yeah.
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone here and watching online. Thank you, Melissa, for that introduction. I wanted to give an overview of kind of current practices and disclosure avoidance that we use on the American Community Survey with a specific focus on our public use microdata sample, and talk a bit about where we want to go in the future with new products and methods for protecting respondent privacy. So Melissa, you stole a bit of my thunder on my second slide, but I'll show you where. So I'm first going to talk about formal privacy and how we can't quite use it for sample surveys yet. Then I'll move on to how Title 13 requires us to balance data privacy and data accuracy in all our releases. I'll give an overview of the current methods that are used to protect respondent confidentiality in the ACS PUMs. I'll talk about new ways we might envision accessing ACS data and the ways we can protect those new ways of accessing it. That will lead into research we're doing on synthetic data methods and validation. And then I'll just reiterate our commitment that we have in the ACS and the Census Bureau in general to transparent communication with stakeholders and our respondents. So there's the thunder that Melissa kind of stole from me. So I wanted to lead off. I think there's some misconceptions about what we want to do with the 2020 disclosure avoidance system. There are currently no plans to apply that system as it is to the ACS. That is not because I don't think it's a great system. It is, in fact, I think one of the major accomplishments I've seen in disclosure avoidance in all my years of working at the Census Bureau. But the simple fact is that the science of how formal privacy frameworks, like the one used for the 2020 DAS, do not necessarily interact with the way with sample surveys in a way that we fully understand. So we have several cooperative agreements that either have looked into or that are currently looking into the interaction of sample surveys with formal privacy. There are numerous issues with how we do surveys, the way we collect samples, the way we adjust weights for non-response, to control the census totals, to make the application of formal privacy more difficult for sample surveys than to something like the census. So what I can say is that any changes that will come to the ACS related to formal privacy will only happen at the speed at which science can move on the subject. So then moving on to, it's not really a census disclosure avoidance talk until someone says Title 13. So Title 13, essentially what it requires is that we release only statistical information about our respondents, right? It should be the releases that the Census Bureau makes should be about people, not about a particular person. And those data, you should not release any information that can be used to identify respondent or their attributes. But on the other hand, we do want our releases to be useful. For instance, in the people in this room, other people using ACS data, we need it to be useful for making decisions. And that's complicated because as other speakers have pointed out, there is an inherent trade-off that you have to make between privacy and the accuracy of the data that you release. Every time you release a new statistic that has in any way new information that you haven't put out before, that is leaking some bit of information about every single respondent that went into that statistic. So it's not as simple as saying like, well, we can do this and there won't be any information, there won't be any privacy risk, and you'll have perfect accuracy. Like that just can't happen. There's always this balance gap. And that's important to us at the Census Bureau because we have issues with confidentiality right now. As others have mentioned, modern computational power makes it possible to leverage all kinds of data sources, pull them together, and make identifications of people from data that you think might have been protected from privacy. We performed an ethical reconstruct and embedded re-identification attack on the 2010 census. That showed particular risks to respondents who had unique attributes within small geographies like census blocks. And so in general, the risk of identity and attribute disclosure of our respondents is a Census Bureau issue. Our surveys and censuses are required to modernize their disclosure avoidance practices to meet that risk. And I think, in fact, all the federal statistical agencies should be looking at the ways they protect the confidentiality of their respondents and asking, can we do things better? So I know there's probably some people in here who are kind of new to the ACS. There might be people here who have been working on the ACS a long time, but have never really thought about confidentiality. So I wanted to go over the ways in which we protect respondent data in the ACS, particularly how we protect respondent data in the ACS public use microdata sample, the PUMS. So traditional disclosure avoidance framework. So unlike what we use for the 2020 census, traditional disclosure avoidance frameworks take an ad hoc approach to assessing risk, right? We imagine some kind of attack that someone might try to do against the data, and we say, okay, can we come up with a method of perturbing the data in a way that should protect from that attack, but that should still allow users to get accurate data? So that has led to the ACS, since it's both an evolution of the former census long form and has had extra questions added after that. It has a mix of disclosure avoidance techniques that are applied to it. And I would say among all the products that we released for the ACS, the PUMS has the most types of protections applied. So what do we do? Well, you might say, okay, maybe someone has kind of a unique value within a very small geography. Can we swap them out with either another person or another household in a way that preserves some statistics, but gets the identifiable record out of the geography that it's in? So that's, we use data swapping to do that. And so you think, okay, so the data's protected now. Well, no, well, maybe there are particular variables that are at risk, either because maybe there's a public version of them available that could be used to link data, respondents back to ACS data. Maybe they're particularly sensitive variables that we don't want people to find out if the link was made. So let's use statistical models to synthesize some of the records for that particular variable. So we call that partial synthesis. This is done to the ACS PUMS. Perturbation methods. So perhaps there are particular combinations of values within a household that make a household stand out. We can think about variables that are associated with that uniqueness and just, fudge them a little bit. So we perturb the value a little bit so you can't directly identify that household in combination of several variables. So we use perturbation methods for that. We do top and bottom coding to variables in the PUMS. So the variables in PUMS will sometimes not have the complete set of values that are possible within the internal ACS data that we cut off at the ends. That's to prevent outlier records from sticking out that we might not have identified as being at risk. So to prevent that from happening, we just don't give you the data beyond a certain point, or perhaps we give you the mean beyond a certain point. Coarsening, so this was mentioned at the last talk. You want to have data on as many categories as you can get for certain variables like race. Sometimes we can't give you all the categories because some of them just don't have a lot of people in them. So what we might do is we might reduce the number of categories that are available. We call this data coarsening. We do this on the PUMS. And last but not least, the PUMS is a public use microdata sample. It is not of the same size in terms of number of rows that the internal ACS data has. We only give you a subsample of the data that is specifically for protecting privacy. So we do all these things to protect data in the ACS PUMS. And I think it's fair to ask, well, what are the effects? What does this do? How does it affect the accuracy of the PUMS data? Does it actually reduce disclosure risk to an extent that we think provides our respondents with the kinds of confidentiality guarantees that we say we're making? Those are fair questions to ask. And I also think it's fair to say that each of these interventions that we do, so when we subsample, when we do swapping, when we coarsen data, when we perturb data, all of those have effects on the estimates and errors that you're going to get out of the PUMS. And so I think it's a natural question to ask, well, can we adjust for those errors? And it turns out for most of them, no. So subsampling, when we do the subsample for PUMS, the weights are readjusted, the replicate weights are readjusted. For the subsampling, that is something that you can get adjustments for in your data and analyses of the PUMS. But for all the other methods, for swapping, for synthetic data, we don't provide adjustments. You just have to pretend that the data are as they are. And this leads to what has been called statistical imaginaries that creep up about the data, right? I can just use the ACS PUMS without worrying about these privacy interventions and everything will be okay. And I can't tell you if that's true or not. I can also not say it's true that we are protecting respondent confidentiality in all the ways that we might want to do. Being able to guarantee certain levels of privacy is an attribute of formally private disclosure avoidance frameworks like we use for the 2020 census, but we don't use those currently on the ACS and certainly not on the PUMS. So can we think of better ways of both providing data in ways that give data users an accurate picture of the accuracy of ACS data while protecting respondent privacy? So let's think about the ways you can actually access ACS data right now. So we have several tiers of data access, starting with things like our public tabulations, the public use microdata samples. Those anyone can download, anyone can use in any way they like. They allow for broad access. The PUMS lets you do exploratory data analysis without having to go into ask for access to internal census data. But they do have increased protections. So as I just showed with PUMS, the PUMS has an awful lot of protections applied to it. And that means larger errors. And I can't necessarily tell you how large those errors get. On the other side of things, we have access through the Federal Statistical Research Data Centers, the FSRDCs. Those require that you have a census benefit to a project and that you get access to internal data after getting special foreign status. And there's not an RDC in every town that you might live in. So they're restrictive in terms of access, but they allow you to do more fine-tuned adjustments in terms of the protections that you will apply to the eventual statistics that you release, and allow you to understand how those methods for protection will affect your margins of error. So what we can do is we can think of adding in a new tier of access to the ACS. And Donna Daly mentioned this in her talk. We were thinking about adding what's called a validation server to ACS. This will provide, I think, a lot of the benefits that users have in going to the FSRDCs for accessing internal ACS data, or even for asking for a special tabulation of ACS data, paying for a special tabulation of ACS data, but allowing that for the general user community. So how that work? So validation server goes along with a fully synthetic data product. So, and oh, my graphics are missing on here, but there was a data set here called the internal reference file. The internal reference file will be a version of ACS internal data that has had no disclosure avoidance applied to it. So it is as pure a look at ACS data as you can get. It could be a data set that is used to test out various other methods of improving accuracy on the survey, such as the inclusion of administrative records, various kinds of modeling for missing data. All of that can be done on this internal reference file. And this internal reference file will be the source for two different kinds of access to ACS data. One would be a fully synthetic data product based upon the internal reference file. So this fully synthetic data will look just like the internal reference file. It had the same number of columns, same number of rows. It wouldn't be a subsample. And that would let you as a data users do all kinds of analyses on ACS data, test out code, see if the results affect something you maybe want to look further into. And then since that data looks just like this internal reference file, we could take your code, run it on the internal reference file internally, send it, that would give us an unperturbed by disclosure avoidance IRF analysis for the analysis that you want to do. And then we can apply disclosure avoidance in a way that allows us, one, to minimize the amount of noise that we have to add for the particular outputs that you want, and two, allows us to give you adjustments to margins of error for the disclosure avoidance. So we can envision this as a new way of accessing ACS data. I should say that's a survey of income and program participation. The SIP already has a version of this called the SIP synthetic beta that uses administrative records as part of the modeling. However, its system is not quite automated. That's going to be part of the hard work we have to do, is making this all work in a way that's automated so anyone can do it, and we don't have to have someone on the other end doing the disclosure review. So what are some of the advantages over the current PUMs? These were also thumbs up. So never use graphics in your presentation. Validated results on the internal data would be unaffected by the disclosure avoidance until we add it. When we add it, we do it in a way that we can tell you about and that you can adjust for. We could share the results of all validations publicly, right? So many times people are asking for the same kinds of analyses. They want the same table, they want to do the same kinds of regressions. So we could release validated results as a way of aiding in replication. The synthetic data can be on the full sample rather than a subsample, and the combined system can allow for substate analyses at a level lower than the public use microdata area that you can own it, that you get on the pumps right now. So I'm not going to give a timeline because every time I do, it just gets extended back a bit. And I think the actual important point is what Amy was talking about in her talk is that we need to have a commitment to openness in how we handle our user and our respondent data, and disclosure avoidance practices should be no different. So we will, on our new ACS disclosure avoidance website, come up with a timeline and give you milestones related to ACS disclosure avoidance and how our progress is going towards those milestones. We will gather use cases from data users to understand how synthetic data and validation can affect decisions, and eventually how formal privacy can do that too. And we will conduct an external user test of the synthetic data and validation system before it goes public, so we can understand how you, the data users, will interact with that system and how we might need to make changes in order for that system to work in the way you do. And if you have any questions after this talk or after this conference, please email us at acsprivacy@census.gov. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rolando. And next we have Leslie Reynolds.
Okie dokie. Can everybody hear me okay in the back? Looks good. Okay. So my name is Leslie Reynolds, as Melissa already said. Thank you for that introduction, Melissa. I'm really happy to be here and excited to be alongside my esteemed co-panelists. And I also wanted to say a thank you to my colleague Jan Vink. I am the head of the band today, the front man, but this presentation couldn't be where it is without him. So thank you, Jan. We had lots of discussions back and forth over our cubicles, thinking things through and talking about priorities. So this is a presentation that we created together. And I have to say, I'm very encouraged by today's discussions and with Rolando's presentation, really great things going forward. And so we're very optimistic and excited to engage with the Bureau and other stakeholders. So today I'll be presenting synthetic ACS microdata and some considerations for both the Census Bureau and stakeholders. A little bit of an outline of what I'll go through today. I'll give a background about the program on applied demographics and our role as both data users and evaluators of data. I'll give a small introduction to the ACS microdata and the upcoming disclosure avoidance system change. And then the primary part of this talk will be incorporating use cases into thinking through the potential for the disclosure avoidance change. So how do we handle these use cases now? And what obstacles would there be with this addition of synthetic data? And finally, I'll conclude with some potential barriers and what we need from the Census Bureau. So PAD is an applied demography group within the Cornell Population Center. We're contracted by the State Data Center in New York to be experts on all things census. We're currently active members and have been for quite some time of the Federal State Cooperative for Population Estimates. And our lead demographer, Jan Vink, who I mentioned earlier, is the FSCPE Steering Committee Chair. This is his second year, I believe. So we have frequent interactions with both state and local government groups about data results and quality. So fast-paced engagements, answering questions, a collaboration between different government bodies and independent organizations. So we were heavily involved in the feedback on the 2020 Census Differential Privacy Demonstration data. Every single round we were involved. We investigated varying biases and accuracy issues in differing practical and everyday analyses that we may do as data users. So a bit about what this is that we're talking about. What is the ACS microdata? It's a sample of full household responses where you have household and individual level responses and data available. So, and for clarification, the public use microdata sample is not used in the creation of the published tables. And this allows for, many of you are probably familiar, creating much more robust and detailed tabulations, whereas the pre-prepared data tabulations have some limitations in who you can make generalizations or produce data about. You can do statistical models based on individual characteristics and look at different members within the household across types of households. And it also includes weights, population and household weights for representative results, and also replicate weights for the calculation of standard errors and MOEs. And the lowest level of geography available is the PUMAs, public use microdata areas, which are non-overlapping areas that partition each state into about 100,000 residents. And the delineated PUMAs can be very similar to counties, but these are based on population. So often they can contain multiple counties. And these are created by the State Data Center and their affiliates. So Jan Venk, our lead demographer, again, he pops up often. He was in charge of proposing these changes in the PUMAs for 2020. And here I have an overview of the current and future access to ACS microdata. So just thinking through what our ACS use looks like now and what it could look like in the future. So on the left, like Rolando said, you can't get through a disclosure avoidance presentation without mentioning Title 13. So we have Title 13 protected ACS data, which goes to disclosure avoidance, swapping, et cetera, suppression, perturbation. And then you end up with your POMS data, which we as the user have access to and can manipulate in our statistical software. In the future, with the synthetic ACS workflow, again, you'd start with the internal data, they synthesize it, goes through a synthesizer and produce the synthetic ACS microdata or data for analysis at the user level. But then in this situation, you would have a validation server. And that's one of the questions that we have is in which cases you would use this validation server and what priorities are there when choosing when to validate your data. So you would submit your analysis and code through the server. It would go back to the Title 13 protected data. They would run your analysis again with the code and send it back with privacy protection to the data user. So first I wanted to acknowledge the Bureau's commitment to transparency and equity, and it's very much appreciated, and we're really encouraged by today's presentations. And we think that our community of data users can really help and collaborate on this process. So this was the quote that first encouraged us to think about this and the future of the ACS. So the Census Bureau's commitment to transparency and decision-making, they're planning a public test of potential synthetic data with a validation service. And they will gather feedback from that test to inform decision-making and the design of an improved disclosure avoidance system. And currently it was planned for mid-2025, but of course that timeline is flexible or it's a work in progress. But that got us thinking about what the path would look like for data users if and when this comes to fruition. Tests have the potential to be really beneficial for the system, but it can also be very complicated and time consuming, as has been a very prominent theme in today's talks. Data quality has many aspects. You have objectivity, utility, integrity, and no one can possibly think about all of the aspects all at once. And we can't expect the census to know about all of these all at once. So as data users, we can come and help inform things that they don't have in everyday development of this system and from the data user perspective. So how would this situation with this synthetic data and this changed workflow, how would it impact our use cases? What are the potential barriers to making an external test successful? There are a lot of unknowns, and how do you test for accuracy and fitness for use, especially if there is no comparison data set to evaluate the new data set. So in the following slides, we'll see a variety of use cases which illustrate the many unknowns and types of questions to ponder when we're considering a synthetic ACS. So we color-coded some issues being addressed in each one. In blue are questions about the synthetic data. Green is questions external stakeholders should think about before the test. And red is questions regarding the validation server. So this first example is very near and dear to the work that we do every day at PAD. We recently had this data question posed from the Department of Language Access at the New York State government level. And so agencies need to know what languages are used across populations in order to be able to provide services like transcription and translation. So the languages are grouped in tabulated data, and microdata has the detailed language spoken at home, but this is not enough to resolve the issue that they had asked for. So Portuguese spoken in Portugal can be very different from Brazilian Portuguese. And they also wanted to know what other scripts are used. For example, different scripts of Punjabi and which areas will need varying resources in terms of language access. So below, I included an example of an aggregated table that you can get from the microdata access tool, places of birth for Portuguese speaking households in New York by the presence of being able to speak English very well. But to create this table or another version from the microdata on your own, it can be a very large process. So you can end up with this massive table, a giant cross tabulation where cell sizes can vary greatly. So above I have the different number of responses, and when you combine that all together, it's just a bear of a data issue. So you have many zero or very small values. And our experience with the top-down algorithm has taught us that with a cross tabulation with many zeros, it can be really tricky for a disclosure avoidance system to strike the balance between privacy and usability. So could a synthesizer handle distributions with a lot of zeros? Would it be able to understand that zeros have a special meaning in varying contexts? And adding margins of error will complicate this process. Are the margins of error from synthetic data expected to match the published MOEs? And with sampling error, the MOEs calculated can be larger from the POMs versus the published tables. And is there a noise component added that compounds on top of the MOE? So as you can see, this is a very complicated and nuanced process that we're thinking through. And moving on to this next example, if you consider household relationships and derived variables. So this example looks at how many children with full-time parents working in poverty or living in poverty, excuse me. So the current procedure is you select the different attributes that you're looking for, and you count children with family income ratio from 0 to 100. And we have certain requirements that we have for the synthetic data and also the validation server. So we need household identifiers. We need similar correlations between the work status of parents, and we need an income to poverty variable. And would this be derived from synthesized households and incomes, or would it be a synthesized ratio? And how do we test from fitness for use in this new environment where we don't know what the basis is for comparison? Moving on to what can appear to be a very simple example, comparing distributions. So in this situation, how do wage distributions differ between male and female teachers? But comparing medians between data might not be enough to say anything about fitness for use or the differences between groups. So medians being the same could be a necessary condition, but isn't necessarily a sufficient condition. So we need metrics to be able to compare these distributions across male and female, and also between POM, synthetic, and validation server data. And if we had a construction of, we need the microdata, and will the validation server return the microdata, or is it some other indicator of the analysis that you submitted? So finally, we wanted to highlight an example using regression. I'm pretty sure most people in the room utilize regression in some way or another. And this is an example modeling migration status from Kyle Walker's presentation on analyzing US Census data, methods, maps, and models in R. So he models whether an individual in the labor force changes residence or moved in the past year as a function of educational attainment, wages, age, class of worker, and family status, and this was specifically for Rhode Island. So would the resultant model be the same or better when built with synthetic data? Rolanda mentioned a lot of the pluses that come with synthetic data, so it's possible that there could be things we couldn't do now that we will be able to do with synthetic data. But what do we mean by the same, and what is better, and how will we know? Wages are currently top coded in the POMS data, but what about in the synthetic microdata? would we be able to compare those measures if one is top coded and one is not? And will we be able to run the same model through the validation server? What will be returned when we input a regression into the validation server? Will it be a privacy protected additional regression? Or will it be saying yes or no, this is good, this is not, or additional data? And how does that compare to the PUMS result? So there's still time to avoid turning that tug of war into a mud fight, although this looks really fun. And it's it's an adventure park, they have all kinds of things, but there are spectators on the sidelines, which we envisioned as users, policymakers, students, and professors, just trying to use the data and not understanding how it impacts what they do every day. So we're willing to help, but there are some things that the Census Bureau and data users can do to facilitate a unified and informed front as we take on this challenge and the necessary technological and modernization of the ACS. So finally, there are some barriers and opportunities to grow this collaboration between data users and the Census Bureau and everything in between. So testing for accuracy and usability and documenting your findings and submitting it is hard. I have to say, during the feedback process for the census for the 2010 differential privacy data, about 85% to 90% of my duties at the time during these periods were devoted strictly to differential privacy. And we have the privilege to have that worked into our contract. We are all things census, so we're able to work on this for short bursts of intensity, but not everybody has the time and access to be able to do this sort of in-depth evaluation. There's also a lack of a common language between the development and the usability. So we need something that harmonizes the language of computer scientists, demographers, and statisticians so that we can compare and help each other work through the additions and necessary changes in this process. There's also a need for a comparison focused on how to use this. Are there differences in the strengths of each approach that the Bureau is considering for the synthetic data? We don't need to know the ins and outs of all of the synthetic options, but we would like to know within the black box what the thinking is getting into the different approaches and what the pros and cons are that they have been thinking through, and just the thought process and how we got here and how the data user can help to advance the progress. So what are the requirements to calculate or compare MOEs, get result from your validation server, your turnaround time, access to the server? These are a lot of questions that are still up in the air. And another theme that we've been seeing all day and in previous presentations is the need for a communication plan and the closing of the feedback loop. Feedback is much more effective if there is room for a back and forth. And I think here is a great potential for a working group. And I think what we need is more facilitation for communication between stakeholders and also the back and forth between the Bureau and stakeholders and other data users. So I think it's better to involve us now throughout the process in a dedicated and less intense way than just bursts of needing feedback like in a timely manner. And then it's a great opportunity to be able to learn from the differential privacy evaluation process and create a solid foundation from which the modern ACS can grow. So together we can find the balance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And now we have a discussant, Dr. Joseph Salvo.
Hello, everybody. The theme of my presentation is going to be about what we can learn from the past to inform the present and to help us with the future. So let's get the pain over with initially. Okay. The move or the rollout of the disclosure avoidance system, which I'll call the DOS, for the 2020 census did not go well. Communication was not good. It really wasn't much. I mean, we could call it a bit of a feedback loop, but the fact of the matter is that the Census Bureau has essentially said this. This is John About and Michael Hawes' recent article. And this highlights something we've been hearing throughout the day, the active role that data users can and should play in shaping the disclosure limitation system. This is a lesson that we've learned from the 2020 rollout. Okay, that we need to do a better job. We and the Census Bureau needs to do a better job. Building on this, again, some more pain, but as the saying says, you can decide whether it's going to hurt you, or maybe you can build and learn from it. And I want you to focus on the bolded text there. Going forward, the Bureau must explore additional approaches to engaging stakeholders. We know there were problems with 2020 in our movement towards 2020. Some of it was pandemic related, but as the National Academy report has said, interim report has said, a bunch of it was self-induced, okay? Trying to use the census, trying to work with the census, using the data disclosure, the differential privacy as the basis for the disclosure avoidance system. That was a tough nut to crack, to say the least, right? It was a very, very difficult thing, perhaps the ultimate test. And it was very difficult. And as a result, many of us need therapy. But everything we've heard today, we've heard all these words. Go back to look at John About's statement. We see the word stakeholder, this word stakeholder engagement's in here. Okay, it's very important. But this is a word we haven't heard. The word is collaboration. And it fits really well. Now moving into the present and what you've heard today, it fits really well with the user-centric approach. One based on collaboration with the data user community. I threw Webster's in here just for the heck of it. You can take a look at what this word means. It's a very important word. It goes beyond a feedback loop. It's true interaction. And the question now is, how is the Bureau going to do this? How are we going to get true interaction? I have to say, I'm a little nervous, and here's why. We've heard several times already today, don't worry, we're not going to use differential privacy for the ACS, all right? Or we're going to put it off to 2019. We're going to put it off to 2028, something. And everybody goes, okay, we're all right. No, we're not. The fact of the matter is that the Census Bureau is working right now on a program to drive the disclosure avoidance system, which you've heard about. Rolando and Leslie have done a great job in describing that. But here's kind of the crux of the matter. You've heard from Sally Keller, John About's successor, new chief scientist at the Census Bureau, that there's an enterprise framework that puts purpose and use smack in the middle of everything. This diagram does two things it does a whole bunch of things, but it does two things really well. It puts purpose and use in the middle of everything, okay? That is directly related to user needs. And notice the outer band. Stakeholder engagement and privacy and confidentiality are on the same level, okay? They are on the same level. So now, we have proposals that you've heard about. There's a new systems that are being thought about and being experimented with. I guess the one we've heard about the most is synthetic data. Well, here's the question. From a technical perspective, you could create a PUMS file in a synthetic way. The Bureau can do that. They have the means to do that. It's working, they're moving forward with it. I ask the question, where are the stakeholders in this? Where are the collaborators in this? all right? Because the technical side of things only gives you one dimension. The other side of this is the perspective of those who use the data. Leslie alluded to this, and I think a very important way. And then there's the hardest nut to crack, the validation survey. The idea that you can create a litmus test for a user that is going to give that user confidence that what that user is generating is close enough to the real data in order to take care of the question at hand. So let me give you a question at hand. This is an actual tabulation from 2009 that Mayor Michael Bloomberg asked me to produce. He did it at 10 o'clock on a Monday morning. I had till 5 o'clock on Tuesday to produce this for a press conference where we were addressing a very common issue in the press, which is the press wants to focus on people leaving the city, but not necessarily on people coming into the city. So we wanted to show the educational attainment of those coming into the city. And the mayor said, Joe, I need it. I want it. And when Mayor Bloomberg asks you for something, you produce it, let me tell you. Now, what is it going to take for me to be able to do this? We're talking about on the fly validation of a PUMS tabulation. The answer is we don't know yet, but this is the kind of thing that needs to be brought to bear on what the Bureau is currently doing. And I want to underline that, currently doing. Now, the snowflake. I love Rob Santos's snowflake. He uses it to provide us with an interesting perspective. And here's one that I like. If you look at a snowflake, it's beautiful. Just like our data sets are beautiful, right? We can, we can create really nice data. When you look really close, though, you see asymmetries. You see little differences in those bands or in the snowflake. Beautiful overall, but fraught with noise internally. There's no perfect data set. The data sets we're working with now have noise, inherent noise, especially sample data sets. Taking that existing noise into account has to be something that the Bureau has to do or needs to do going forward. In the 2000 census, again, going back in history, for the 2000 census, the Census Bureau actually applied swapping to a census tract based on how much noise, defined then as imputation, was already in the data. So they said, why do we have to apply it across the board? The sledgehammer of differential privacy applies it across the board. Is that necessary? Is it something that we want to do going down the road? CSAC, the Census Scientific Advisory Committee, made a recommendation last month, essentially saying, or in March, essentially saying you need to do more research on sample data sets. So here are the key questions. What does the application of the algorithm, how does it compromise the quality of statistical data? Whatever algorithm you come up with, all right? How can collaboration be achieved given these confidentiality issues? The FSRDCs are good, they're important, but they're not a complete solution. The local governments that are going to be doing this work will not be able to deal with a lot of this, all right? So are there examples of successful collaborations? And if I may, I really want to focus on this one. In the lead up to the 2000 census, the Census Bureau contracted with the Association of Public Data Users to create a working group. The working group, not unlike, I guess, what Leslie was alluding to earlier, the idea that you invite in collaborators and you come up with a joint solution to something. I was on that. I was in that working group, and we got the actual game plan that the Census Bureau was going to put out there. And we went out, it was part of a spoke system of hub and spoke, where we went out to our users and we brought back all that knowledge to the Bureau, and then we sat down and discussed it in the same room. It's not just give me your comments. It's not a Federal Register notice, which unfortunately has been used in the past. And then lastly, there's this issue of statistical product equity. Right now, as most of you know, you cannot get data for very small jurisdictions with a high degree of reliability like you can in larger places. How are we going to fix this? And I think we heard this morning, the answer is we're going to see greater use of administrative data to help us fill in the gaps, to support data from the ACS. So let me just end on a very hopeful side. This is from Sally Keller's presentation at the Population Association of America meeting last month in New Orleans. And she repeated it again today. We have this triple trade-off. We have availability of data. People want data for small areas, but they want it accurate data, and we have to preserve confidentiality. But we have to do so in concert with the data users. We have to do so in concert with these people who are the stakeholders. They provide the context for evaluation that is so important to what we're doing. So collaboration needs to be the word going forward, and the Bureau needs to do this in a full engagement. And I'm not talking about issuing something and saying, what do you think? All right, I'm talking about inviting people in and saying, together, we're going to figure this out. So lastly, how do you rise to the occasion? To summarize, the statistical product first framework is that spirit of collaboration. That is what it is, okay, with purpose and use in the middle. Alternative methods have to be considered to take into account the noise already in the data. All right, that is something that has not occurred. It needs to occur. And lastly, real life applications, testing done in concert with the users, because without the user community, you can't determine purpose and use. You can't determine data utility. You need to have those inputs from the user community. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joe. So next we're going to have Q&A for about 22 minutes. So for those of you who are remote, you can put your questions in the panel chat function in Hubelo. I hope that you have that link so that I don't have to read it out. Okay, good. Thank you. So let me just start off while those questions are coming in. Let me just start off with more of a really basic question, because as I mentioned before, let's just do some level setting. You know, there are a variety of users who may not have for whom these concepts of synthetic data servers and differential privacy may be completely new. So if you are a new data server, why do they need to worry about disclosure avoidance? And what are the ways that they can engage on this topic as a data user? Rolando, maybe?
So when you say worry about disclosure avoidance, in what way? Like worrying about accounting for it, worrying about why we need it for the survey? What do you mean?
So why would a data user want to be aware about this and be a responsible data steward as a data user?
So I think generally, even if there weren't Title 13, right, I think it's best data practice to be able to tell respondents, how are you going to use the data and how are you protecting their confidentiality, right? And so I think data users who are new to the ACS have to understand that part of the reason why people give us data in the first place, and even though the ACS is legally required, we don't like break down people's doors if they don't answer. So I mean, we're at non-response, right? So we would, if there were to be an attack against the ACS that caused re-identifications to happen and that was made public, that could have an adverse effect on getting people to respond to the ACS. And as we've heard before already, people are already reducing the amount in which they respond to the ACS. So I think there has to be an appreciation when data users come to the Census Bureau asking for data, like we are giving you a bit about information about all the respondents who we have. And so I think Amy was really good in pointing out that I think what data users need to ask themselves is, what do I really need to answer the question And how's the way I can get that in a way that gives me both ways of adjusting for the disclosure avoidance that happens, but that allows the proper amount of disclosure avoidance to happen so that we don't have issues of data confidentiality breaches.
Essentially, as I was told back in the late 2000s, late noughts, there was a data breach, and I was told by Howard Hogan, who was then the Associate Director for Demographic Programs, that basically with data breaches, we would get no data, and with no data, we have no data to give and to show. And so it was very important to us, imparted on us, all of us at the Bureau, how important it was to be proper data stewards for the data. So let me pause. I have a whole slew of questions, but I'd rather hear from you. Does anybody in the audience have, in the in-person or online audience, have a question?
I have an online question
Yes.
and then I'll circulate. So Glenn Rice asked, is the synthetic data plus validation system intended just for use with ACS PUMs, or is the goal to eventually roll it out for all ACS products?
Thanks for the question. Yes, it is intended to be a possible contender for a replacement to PUMs. Of course, no decisions have been made actually yet about whether or not PUMs and the synthetic data plus validation could live side by side. We're just not at the point where those decisions have been made. But yes, this is not intended to replace any published tables or access to the FSRDC or the ability to get special tabulations.
Like there are microphones in the audience as well.
I very much liked Joe's pointing us toward paying attention to the noise that's already inherent in the sampling. And given that many of us are interested in the relationship between census response rate and ultimately differential undercount. And NRFU is, from my perspective, a interesting source of noise. And we'd like to understand more about what's happening in that introduction of noise into the ultimate tabulations. And given that, I'm wondering why it is that the Bureau has felt that it needed to apply disclosure avoidance to its publication of operational data on proxy interviews, imputations, and use of administrative records.
I guess I'm not aware of application of noise directly to those products. If there's anyone from ACS who would like to take that instead. We do have noise added to the completed interviews. That is just so that it makes it harder to identify exactly which respondents actually answered the survey, but that is the only noise injection I'm aware of. Joe, sure.
I'm having just finished my training for special sworn status. I remember looking at all of these rules, and indeed this is the case where data involving a process to create the data is actually privacy protected. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that.
Yeah, I mean, any data-derived decision, right, made by respondent data, including whether or not they responded, is Title 13. So Title 13 very much applies, pretty much all of it.
Other questions in the audience? Yes.
So less of a question, more of a plug. So I work with the National Institute of Standards and Technology on I'm a contractor, but I work with them for student task. And I have a little bit of instant gratification to offer for people who have been watching this panel and are very curious about how synthetic data works, might potentially work on the American Community Survey, what methods are out there, how they compare to traditional methods. We've been doing a program where if you Google, I came up with this name, it's not very distinctive, but it also doesn't occur on Google. So you You can only find us. It's collaborative research cycle. So the whole idea that's being pitched here, that you need to have a engineering for solutions, you need to then have engagement, you need to have research, and so on from the research back to the engineering. This is the idea, the premise of this program, which is trying to do data de-identification in public. So what we have is a selection of excerpts of ACS data, chosen specifically because they are diverse and complicated and likely to cause equity problems. We have a wide collection of de-identification techniques, dating from swapping the STC micro library, if you're familiar with that, all the way up to differentially private, to GANs, to synthetic techniques that are not differentially private. And what we have is a giant archive of very comprehensive utility metrics, reports on how all of these techniques work on these data sets. We're going to be releasing that archive later this week. Along with that is going to come a call for papers, and we would very much like it if people would go satisfy their curiosity. Take a look at what's going on with the data with all these techniques, and tell us what they find. We're soliciting 3-page papers with a submission in September. And we are very much interested in input from privacy researchers. We are very much interested in input from people who do look at data, who are data users, who can go find equity issues, who can find artifacts and bias, who can talk about use cases. It's a reduced feature set. It's got 24 features, but they're the hard ones. We have a good sample of interesting things. So that's my plug. And I will excuse it by saying, I think all 3 people on the panel were forewarned I was going to do it. And I'll pass this on to somebody else.
May I, Christine, let me ask you, is it fair to say that a group of people will be needed to interpret a lot of that information? For example, a local government demographer or statistician. Is that a fair assessment? Okay.
Thank you.
Following up on what Christine was just saying, and I will amplify it again, collaborative research cycle. That's really drawing the line between the geeks and the nerds, okay? And you need to hear from the geeks and the nerds. It's hard to have the geeks and the nerds at the same table, but even more so when you invite them to the table, you've lost most of the users. You know, that is a certain class of user. How are you going to have engagement that draws the people that want to get into the weeds of the technical aspects from the people that just want to know if they're going to get their number out of it? And aside from that, speaking as the current president of the Association of Public Data Users, if we were invited to the table, I would nominate Joe Salvo to lead that work because he just put himself out there. So, but the question about how you have appropriate, thorough engagement when some of it is geeky, some of it's nerdy, and then there are just people that are data consumers that don't want to come to that meeting of the nerds and the geeks.
So I'm a jock, so I don't know anything about this nerd or geek stuff. But so I mean, I think there are going to be different styles of communication that will be necessary. You know, for instance, with the synthetic data, we could put the code out that we use to generate it, not necessarily all the parameters we use for it, but if people want to know how the system works, anyone who wants to really get their nerd on can go to github.com and look at it. That would be something we could do. You don't have to do that if you're a data user who just wants to get some tables. If you're one of those data users, I think what we have to do is document properly use cases of the system, right? How do you get tables out of the system? And how do you interpret the results that you get? So documentation, I mean, we are really not used to documenting a lot of our disclosure avoidance practices at the US Census Bureau before differential privacy came along. That's partially out of fear, right? Like we are not allowed to discuss various parameters of our disclosure avoidance processes. I can tell you the swap rate. I can tell you all the variables that we synthesize with partial synthesis. I can tell you what variables that we perturb. So it can be hard to communicate. Things like full synthesis and validation will let us be a lot more transparent in that regard.
Thank you. So let me make a comment on that too, which is that, so how can you help data users actually use the data responsibly, right? Thinking about all the different kinds of data users who are out there. So what are some of the things that data users need in order to better use these data responsibly? And one of the things that there are two things. One thing that I've been thinking about is when the ACS came online in 2005, there were all these resources. There were these Compass handbooks that were geared towards specific types of data users, like educators, et cetera. So, is that the kind of thing that is being thought about, for like different kinds of, not the power users, but regular people, who just want the number, as Amy said. And then the other thing that I think about is last year when, I'll do my own plug, when CNStat did a workshop on the 2020 demographic and housing characteristics file data, some of one theme that came out a lot from that workshop was, can you help us think about how to use these data? We understand that there's going to be noise infused, due to differential privacy. So, can you help us? Can you label things with like a label such as like green, yellow, red, like use with caution? And even on the American Community Survey, there were times where, there were years where there was a slight data break, maybe it wasn't a complete data break, but a slight data break. And there were notes in the documentation that said compare with caution, for instance. So, what are some of the thoughts about like helping that lower level or newer level sort of data user?
Well, so I think, for instance, when we do the external user tests of the synthetic data validation system, it will be important to get, a spread of users across the geek and dork spectrum, and including some data users who are newer data users and who aren't using the system in complicated ways and maybe don't understand how to get correct margins of error out of the ACS. We will need to get their perspectives in using the system because they will be part of our user base. So yes, I think we need to avoid. We need to avoid the tempting thing to do is just to go to the squeakiest wheels and have them be the people who are testing. As far as documentation, I think there's a lot of opportunities nowadays. 2005, doesn't seem like a long time ago, but I think we can do more things in terms of like, digital resources, have examples online, notebooks people can go to for use cases, example use cases of using synthetic data and validation that I think could be illustrative and useful for some of our more basic data users.
Awesome. And I think it's hard because a lot of those resources or that you could produce also take resources for input, like people who have the time and dedication, or it's their job to create the resources for use by different levels of data users. And it's also easy to miss the middle part of the spectrum to just of ACS data users to just start with, this is how you retrieve the data, or end with, you can go to the GitHub and pull the synthetic data or the synthetic coding and be able to run it yourself. There's something in between where, like Melissa mentioned, like a step-by-step things that you need to consider, even everyday data users and people who use it once a month, once a year, but a varying level, like a sliding scale of access and having the red, yellow, green of what to do and what not to do at no matter what level you are. And that takes a lot of extra thought and time and dedication to not just go to the basic level of this is how you pull the table and the more advanced level. But I think that feedback from the data users could also be helpful, like what use cases, but also a summary of what work that we do rather than just specific cases, because you could never, it's an infinite number of use cases that are out there. So, or did you have something you wanted?
Yeah, I want to go back to something that Amy mentioned this morning. If you, my impression, this I'm speaking for myself now, is that there's a lot of experimentation going on regarding the synthetic file. I mean, we know that, it's a fact, right? But Amy's point this morning, and which I will repeat now, is you don't want to create something, then go out only to find out that it really doesn't cut it. You want to have us in the creation of a product. So this way you shape it in a way that at least satisfies a series of basic criteria. So that is a point of concern right now, because that mechanism doesn't exist. It's being formulated. You saw the curated data enterprise, the whole enterprise initiative at the Bureau calls for it. And there's things are out of sync a bit. And I just want to make sure that that's out there on the table, because you can fix it. You can fix it in a way so that we don't repeat history. And, you know, that's the hope, because there is some time here, right? We didn't have the luxury of time moving up to 2020 for whatever reason.
If I could just add something, Melissa.
Yeah.
So I would like to remind everyone that the sequence of people involved don't just go straight from people working in disclosure avoidance to external stakeholders using the data. Okay, like there is a whole group of subject matter experts. My wife is one of them, who look at our data pre and post EA and tell us about issues that they see. And they are certainly going to get a look at this data in a very intimate way, tell us the issues that they see, tell us how validation is working, not working, where the synthetic data is good, where it's not good. So you do have advocates very much for accuracy inside the Bureau. So I just want to make sure everyone knows that.
So I just wanted to bring this back around to data usability. You know, the Evidence Act does not want the government to collect data for the sake of collecting data. We want to use the data. And so while confidentiality of the data is critically important, if we sacrifice the usability of that data, then we've actually gone against the Evidence Act and that the data isn't important. So finding that balance between usability and protecting the data is a critical need. And I think that a large part of that is that communication, that collaboration with the data users to understand how that data is really being used. And I don't just mean sort of the power use. I mean, it's the full spectrum. And this is what we've been saying in this room, but it's critically important. And as the technology changes even faster, more and more people are sort of being left behind and not understanding all of the what is possible now. You know, with neural weapons, chat, GPT all the time now, but it's that kind of thing that is really changing the landscape at lightning speed and is making it even more challenging for the Census Bureau and the federal government and all the data users to be able to continue to use the data and to continue to have the data. So that's, you know, something that we should not lose sight of.
Thank you.
I think we have
I
a
think-
question online that I've been
Oh,
neglecting, and then
okay.
I'll come over here. Okay. There is an anonymous question. Let me see. Subject. How important are potential data users' perceptions of representativeness in this conversation about DAS? For example, I have never been asked to respond to the ACS. I suspect the concept of synthetic data could adversely affect the public's sense of the quality of the ACS.
So I'm glad they used anonymous as their name when telling me that they have responded to the ACS. So hey, privacy is important. So I think the one stakeholder group that I haven't really heard mentioned a lot, and this is just kind of getting more general about things, are the respondents, right? And not even just the respondents, just like the people in the United States generally, right? They need this data for decisions to be made about where resources go. We are trying to do, why I have issues with current disclosure avoidance methods is that I really can't tell people how those decisions are getting affected by the ways we do disclosure avoidance now. So we want to change that. So I think the DAS was great in the sense that this is what a fully transparent disclosure avoidance system looks like, right? You see all the warts and all. We have the opportunity in the ACS to do other kinds of methods, since we don't have to be formally private at the start, that will let us kind of titrate towards understanding where the balance point needs to be. And then as we start integrating more formality of mathematics into the privacy framework, we can try to either stay where we are or give reasons why things need to move, and then people can adjust how they make decisions. I guess I don't know. I don't want to. I don't want this to be totally about litigating DAS. I think in the ACS we have a lot of opportunity, and part of the reason why I didn't talk a lot about timeline is because, like Joe was saying, you know, if we, as you start to get near deadlines, as Amy mentioned, you start to dive into your silo and just do the thing that you need to do and not talk to anybody. So we're going to try to make it work. We're not quite at the stage where we can take a lot of input and be proactive with it, just because we're still figuring out how to produce a linkable housing unit in person file, right? Like we have these technical issues that we're trying to fix. So that's all I'll say.
So Sally Keller, I just feel like I want to bring us up a little bit of a level as we close out this conversation. So again, I'm the chief scientist at the Census Bureau. So this is new, the synthetic data and the validation server idea, this is a new direction for the Bureau. And I think there's a subtlety that maybe we're not recognizing that I think is really exciting, is that we're introducing a new way for data users to interact with the Census Bureau and with our data and our data products. The validation servers, server concept, which we're exploring in the context of the ACS, it's a format that allows you to bring your question to the Bureau and let the Bureau respond, as opposed to the Bureau pushing out every bit of data that then has huge issues along with all kinds of confidentiality applied to it. It's a new modality of interaction. And that's what's really exciting that we need to talk about. What are other new modalities of interaction between the users and the Bureau, for which we can then explore how best to push out and answer those questions with statistics, statistical products, while still adhering to our confidentiality. So it's just a really new paradigm. And that's why I think we're really excited about it at the Bureau. Other questions in the room?
I just like to advocate for the advocates internally and externally to pay attention to the really small samples, subgroups who work in perhaps small areas that need representation. For example, farm workers in the Central Valley, of whom there are few really in the ACS. And when you add noise, I don't know what happens to them. And there are actually very few data sets that you can look at farm workers in. Or if you take African Americans in the Central Valley of California, you have the same issue. There really aren't that many. And so when you introduce disclosure, disclosure avoidance, how are those people being represented? And I don't know the answer to that. And I just hope the answer isn't, well, then we can't ask these questions. We have to go to another data set, because that makes, that interferes with the bonding of the community to the census and to the ACS. So I'm just putting a plug for internal and external advocates on that.
So can I just sort of like modify or add the flip side to your comment and your question, which is, I like to think about not just disclosure, but I like to think about that next step of who's differentially harmed by disclosure, right? And that's a sort of the flip side of that comment and that question, which is that it's often the same groups that that want data, but also might be differentially harmed by the disclosure of data. So I'm just curious how people on the panel think about that, and perhaps others in the audience think about that.
I can certainly see an upside, and like Sally Keller mentioned about the new modality, that there may be a chance after all of this thinking through of the synthetic data and the validation server, that there may be an opportunity to preserve the integrity of the original protected ACS data and then create a comparable PUMS data set. But the issue is, how do you know who's being impacted, and will the groups who are impacted the most and also have the most to lose by not having the data, is that always the same group? And does it vary depending on what synthetic algorithm that we use? So I think that's just something that's going to be thought of in the next few years, but also a very dynamic and important issue to consider who we're leaving out.
A conversation needs to take place. The data user community and the Census Bureau. You're never going to guarantee 100% of anything. So in the case of a small group, what are they willing to give up in exchange for getting some data? All right. What is that balance? And the user community has to weigh in on that. That is an element that's missing, right? Is that dialogue which says we can never give you 100%. And there's a group at the Census Bureau called, oh God, DCEP, my acronyms are bad. And this, forget the decennial.
Data Stewardship Executive Policy.
Thank you. Yeah, so they make a determination, and that determination is never going to be 100 zeros, so to speak. It's always going to be, what is that level that we're willing to tolerate? And the question needs to be put to the user community, because in exchange for giving up a little bit, you get more accurate data. What matters? In this case, you have an obligation to provide some data that's useful. So that is a really tough question. I don't want to, I mean, it's really a tough question, but it needs to occur with the user community.
Well, I would also say that what's missing is the respondent community as well, right? Who aren't necessarily data users, but Rolando?
No, actually, Melissa, I was referring to the fact that the people who do respond, right? That's what you were really talking about. An incentive for them to respond is that they're going to get some value added back, right? So it does really, and that's really what I was alluding to.
So I think if we're going to talk about getting results for very small communities, general groups of people, we have to think about what's the instrument going to be for making that happen. And I think something like validation is going to be a place where it will happen more likely than in something like the public use microdata, right? Like there's just so much detail that has to go on PUMs, right? And it, like you can ask all of these questions from PUMs. Those extra questions that you're not asking are blocking the ones that you want to ask any of the time when it comes to disclosure avoidance. So we have to think, as Sally was talking about, what are the products we actually need to answer which questions?
Okay, so we're a little bit past, but I think it was a good conversation. So thank you for staying a little bit later. I believe that there's a break until 3:50 p.m. That's 3:50. 3:50 p.m. And there are for the virtual participants, there are lounges where you can network. So thank you. We'll see you again at 3:50.